The engine was off. That was the first thing. The silence of a machine that weighed 57 tons, sitting completely still in the dark, holding its breath the way men hold their breath before something begins that cannot be stopped once it starts. It was the 4th of July, 1943. Not yet 3 in the morning. The Tiger sat on the western bank of the Donets River in southern Russia. On and inside the fighting compartment, the air was already thick with the smell of machine oil and the faint metallic residue that never entirely left the gun barrel no matter how carefully you cleaned it. Outside, the temperature was above 20 degrees Celsius. Inside the tank, it was warmer than that. It was always warmer than that. Carl Wendell rested his forehead against the rubber padding of the gunner's sight and looked at nothing. He had been in this position before, waiting before an operation that had been planned for weeks and that was now hours or minutes from beginning. He had been in it on the Panzer IV outside Moscow and in the mud around Rev and in the various positions along this front that the summer of 1942 had required him to occupy. The waiting was its own discipline. Not the discipline of action, but the discipline of stillness, even of not spending the body's energy on the anticipation of something that would demand the body's full resources when it arrived. You held yourself in a kind of suspended state, present enough to respond to whatever the next minutes brought, still enough not to exhaust yourself responding to the minutes before them. Through the glass he could see a tree line to the east, barely distinguishable from the dark sky above it. He could see the suggestion of a river he could not actually see, perhaps 400 meters ahead, a line he knew was there, because the map said it was there, and because the smell of standing water reached him even through the sealed hatches of the vehicle. On the other side of that river was the 7th Guards Army. On the other side of that river were the trenches and the minefields and the anti-tank guns dug into the high ground on the eastern bank, and the artillery batteries positioned to bracket every crossing point along this stretch of water. Well, he had been told all of this in the briefing. He had been given maps. He put no particular emotion into thinking about it. Behind him, Franz Huber shifted his weight on the ammunition bins. Franz was 20 years old, the youngest man in the crew, with broad hands and a stillness about him that had nothing to do with calm and everything to do with the particular quality of a person who has decided not to think about certain things. He had been a baker's apprentice in Regensburg before the Wehrmacht. He did not talk about that. None of them talked about what they had been before, not because any agreement had been made about it, because the present tense was the only one that had operational relevance, and the past was a country that existed somewhere behind all of them, in a direction that the current heading of their lives did not accommodate looking toward. What mattered about Franz was the speed of his hands and the absence of any tendency to flinch when the gun fired, and on both counts Carl had nothing to complain about. He had made sure of that during training, running Franz through the loading sequence until the man could do it in complete darkness, which was sometimes exactly the condition they would be working in. Miller sat at the driver's controls and said nothing. Miller almost never said anything. He was not unfriendly. He simply operated at a frequency that did not include unnecessary conversation, and Carl had always found this arrangement satisfactory. Hauptmann Riedel sat in the commander's position above and behind Carl, his voice low and steady on the radio, receiving transmissions, acknowledging, transmitting back. His voice had a quality that Carl had spent 2 years learning to read. In ordinary circumstances, it was flat and precise, stripped of everything except the content of what was being communicated. When the fighting started, it became something slightly different, not louder, not more urgent, more compressed, the way a man compresses his breathing when he is carrying something heavy, taking shorter breath, making each one count. Right now it was still flat and precise. They were still in the waiting. Somewhere to the north, distant enough that it arrived as muffled percussion rather than distinct sound, hard artillery was firing. It had been firing intermittently for the better part of an hour. Carl listened to it through the hull of the tank the way you listen to weather through the walls of a building, trying to determine direction and intensity without being able to see the sky. He could not tell from that distance whose guns they were. He would understand later. The signal came at 3:47. A series of flares went up along the western bank, further south, not directly above them. And then the German artillery barrage opened. and the night became something that the word night no longer adequately described. The sound inside a tank during an opening barrage is not a collection of sounds. It is a single continuous physical event, a compression of air that you feel simultaneously in your chest and your teeth and behind your eyes. A pressure that does not come from any one direction because it comes from everywhere at once. Karl had experienced it before. On the Panzer IV outside Moscow in the winter of 1941, in the grinding defensive actions around Rushev, where the ground was frozen solid and the engagements happened at ranges that left no room for the kind of work he preferred. He knew what it felt like. Knowing what something feels like does not make it smaller when it arrives. Franz said something. Karl did not hear the words. Riedel's voice came through the intercom, measured and certain, the order to advance. Müller started the engine. The Tiger moved forward through the darkness toward the river. Karl kept his eye at the sight. Through it, the far bank was beginning to materialize as a faint shape, lit intermittently by the muzzle flashes of the German guns and the answering flashes of the Soviet positions on the high ground to the east. He was watching for the things that would become targets, not searching frantically. Watching the way a man watches who has learned that the eye finds what it is ready to find, and that readiness is a form of patience. The bridge at the crossing point was ahead of them and slightly to the north. Engineers had been working on it through the night, reinforcing the spans for the weight of the Tigers. 57 tons per vehicle, and there were multiple vehicles heading for the same crossing point in the dark, under fire, with the entire eastern bank lighting up in the rhythmic orange flicker of a battle that had already started without them. The problem became visible before they reached the crossing. The bridge was intact. The approach to the bridge was not. In the darkness and the confusion of the opening barrage, vehicles had stacked up along the western bank. Infantry half-tracks, supply trucks, artillery pieces being repositioned. The road to the bridge had become a corridor of stopped metal, and the corridor was not moving, and somewhere ahead in that corridor was the crossing they needed to reach. Riedel's voice on the radio was calm. Karl could hear the calculation in it, the rapid assessment of a situation that had no good options, only options with different costs. He was talking to Hartmann, whose Tiger was somewhere behind them. Karl caught fragments. The bridge. The order of crossing. How many vehicles were already on the other side? Müller did not wait for a specific instruction. He understood, from long experience with Riedel and with the geometry of the situation, and what was required. The Tiger's weight and its width had a clarifying effect on traffic. Vehicles that could not move sideways found that they could, when the alternative was being pushed sideways by 57 tons of German armor, moving at walking pace with no indication of stopping. Müller took them through gaps that would not have existed without the Tiger's presence in them, and Karl held the gun at zero elevation and watched the far bank through the sight and waited. The bridge held. On the eastern side of the Donets, the Soviet artillery had found the range of the crossing point. Karl understood this from the sound of the rounds arriving, not the diffuse background fire of the opening barrage, which covered a wide area without specific intention. This was adjusted fire, walking in on a fixed point, each salvo landing closer to the bridge than the one before it, in increments that indicated a battery commander who knew his business. Rounds were landing in the river, to throwing columns of water up past the bridge railings. Rounds were landing on the eastern bank approach. Infantry who had crossed ahead of them were down in whatever cover they could find. Karl fired for the first time at 4:22 in the morning. The sight had found muzzle flashes on the high ground to the northeast. An anti-tank gun, 45 millimeters by the interval and intensity of its fire, positioned to cover the bridge approach from approximately 900 meters. He told Riedel the bearing and the range. Riedel was already seeing it. He gave the order and Karl put the crosshairs on the flash point and waited for it to fire again to confirm the position. When it fired again, he squeezed the trigger. The sound inside the Tiger when the 88 millimeter fires is not a bang. It is a physical event that begins in the gun and moves through the metal of the vehicle and into the body of every man sitting in contact with that metal. The breech comes back. The casing ejects. The air in the fighting compartment compresses and releases in the same instant. A sharp pressure change that you feel in your ears and your sinuses regardless of how many times you have experienced it. And then Franz is already moving. The next round coming up, the breach closing. The sequence Carl had practiced hundreds of times expressing itself without conscious direction. The body executing what the mind had already internalized past the point of needing to think about it. The anti-tank gun did not fire again. Riedel acknowledged. He did not say anything else. There were other targets. They came off the bridge and onto the eastern bank and into a situation that bore little resemblance to what the briefing maps had described. The infantry battalions that had crossed earlier in the night had pushed forward toward the first objective on the eastern bank and had been stopped. The maps had indicated a cleared lane through the minefield belt that was supposed to exist by the time the Tigers crossed. The lane was either not cleared or not where the map said it was. Infantry were stopped at the edge of the minefield. Some of them had found it in ways that could not be undone. Behind them, on the western bank, the rest of the crossing had gone wrong. The bridge, already carrying more weight than it had been reinforced to handle, had developed a problem with the central span shortly after Tiger 133 crossed. The span had shifted. The crossing was halted. The remainder of the division was on the wrong side of the river. For the first day of Operation Citadel's southern push, 6 Tigers were on the eastern bank of the Donets, with the river behind them, a minefield ahead of them. 9 Soviet artillery working over the bridgehead with systematic attention. Riedel found a position on a low rise to the left of the approach road. From there, they had elevation over the flat ground ahead and clear sight lines to the Soviet anti-tank gun positions in the tree line at the edge of a collective farm to the northeast. The 45mm guns they were facing could not penetrate the Tiger's frontal armor at 1,200 meters. When they could not penetrate it at any range against the frontal plate, but they were hitting the infantry in the open, and they were hitting the lighter vehicles that had crossed with them, and so Carl worked through them methodically. That is the only honest way to describe it. There is no drama in the mechanics of the work itself. You find the target through the sight, you establish the range. So you account for the angle of presentation and the atmospheric conditions and the accumulated thermal behavior of the gun barrel after extended firing. You wait for the moment when the sight picture is as clean as it is going to be. You fire. Between targets, you scan. You do not stare at a burning vehicle when there may be another vehicle that has not yet started burning. This was the discipline Carl had built over 2 years and 2 different tanks on 2 different parts of the Russian front. It was not natural in the sense of being instinctive. It was natural in the sense of being practiced past the point where practice ends and the thing practiced becomes simply the way you are. The aircraft appeared at approximately 10 in the morning. Carl heard them before he saw them. The sound of engines from the south, multiple aircraft, heavy, coming in low over the river. Riedel had the commander's hatch open and was watching them approach. Carl tracked them through the sight as they came in over the western bank and banked toward the bridgehead, the sun behind them, their profiles dark against the pale sky. There was a moment of perhaps 3 seconds when everything on the eastern bank went quiet in a specific way. Not the quiet of a lull in fighting, the quiet of several hundred men simultaneously doing the same calculation, looking at the same aircraft, trying to determine the same thing. They were German. The first stick of bombs went into the river approach on the eastern bank, 200 meters behind Tiger 133. The ground shook in a way that was different from artillery, a longer, deeper rolling that came up through the suspension and into the seat and into Carl's spine. The second stick was closer. Riedel's voice came through the intercom, and it was not giving an order. It was something that came from somewhere other than the part of him that was a tank commander. A single short phrase that Carl heard clearly and filed away in the part of his memory reserved for things that were true but could not be acted upon. Miller had already put the Tiger into reverse. Franz had his hands braced against the ammunition racks. Carl kept his eye at the sight because there was nothing else to do with it, and because the sight was his point of orientation in a situation where orientation was the only thing he could control. And the Luftwaffe made 2 more passes before someone got the recognition signal to them. When the smoke and the dust settled enough to take account of the damage, the word came through on the radio. The commanding general of the 6th Panzer Division had been wounded, not by Soviet fire, by German aircraft on the first morning of the largest armored offensive the Wehrmacht had attempted in more than a year. Riedel heard this and said nothing for a long time. Carl noted the silence and returned to scanning the tree line. That was when he began to understand what the minefield actually was. Not that evening, when the full report came through. Not later, when the pioneers had finished their assessment. In the afternoon of the 5th of July, watching the engineers work from 200 meters back through the site, he began to understand it by watching what they were doing and how long it was taking them. The pioneers worked in pairs. Two men, one always two, moving forward on hands and knees along the front edge of the minefield belt, probing the ground with rods at a depth and interval that followed a careful pattern. One man probed, the other watched, not the ground immediately ahead, the flanks, the drainage ditches at the edge of the field where Soviet anti-tank rifle teams had positioned themselves to make exactly this kind of work as costly as possible. The Tigers were there to make it less costly. Well, that was their function for most of that afternoon. Not to advance, not to fight tanks, to suppress the positions that were targeting the men on their hands and knees in the dirt. It was not what anyone had imagined Tiger tanks were for. It was what had to be done. As the afternoon went on and the pioneers made their slow progress, on the scale of what they were working through became apparent not from any single report, but from the accumulated evidence of how long it was taking and what the engineers were finding as they went deeper into the belt. It was not a minefield. It was a system. Multiple layers of anti-tank and anti-personnel mines laid in overlapping patterns, with deliberate gaps that led not through the belt but deeper into it. False lanes designed to channel vehicles into kill zones where multiple weapons could engage simultaneously. The ground had been prepared since February, not by engineers alone, by engineers and by soldiers, and, the word came through eventually, by civilians, by the people who lived on this land and who had been given tools and told where to dig and what to bury. 300,000 people had worked on the defensive system around the Kursk salient. They had worked for 5 months. The minefields the briefing maps had indicated were real, but a symbol on a map and the physical reality of a defensive system built by 300,000 human beings over 5 months are not the same thing. And the difference between them was becoming evident in the slow progress of men on their hands and knees in the July heat of southern Russia. Carl watched through the sight and did not think about the number. He thought about the ground, the specific ground ahead of him, the way it lay, the places where the soil was disturbed and the places where it was not, the drainage patterns that would have influenced where a practical engineer would choose to place a mine and where they would judge the ground unsuitable. He was reading the land through the optics the way he read every landscape he worked in, not aesthetically, not with any sentiment about the countryside of southern Russia in summer, but as a problem with physical parameters that could be analyzed if you paid attention to the right things. What he was beginning to understand, without forming it as a thought, was that the people who had laid this minefield had paid attention to the right things. They had understood the ground. They had understood what an attacker would try to do and where an attacker would try to go, and they had placed their work accordingly. This was not the work of an army that had been caught by surprise and thrown together a hasty defense. This was the work of people who had known this attack was coming and had spent the winter preparing the ground for it. The briefing maps had shown minefields. The briefing maps had not conveyed what it meant to try to cross a minefield prepared by 300,000 people who knew you were coming. So Carl thought about this for a long time in the July heat, with the sight trained on the minefield belt and the sounds of the battle reduced temporarily to the background work of suppression and patience. He was 22 years old. He had been a soldier for 2 years and a gunner for most of that time. And in those 2 years, he had developed an understanding of his work that was precise and detailed and reliable within its own limits. But it was an understanding built from the gunner's seat, and from the specific perspective of a man whose relationship to the battle was mediated by optics and elevation controls, and the particular distance at which the 88mm gun made problems solvable. What the pioneers were revealing to him on the afternoon of the 5th of July was a dimension of the battle that the gunner's sight could not fully represent. Not the tactical dimension of ranges and angles and engagement solutions. The human dimension of a decision made by 300,000 people over 5 months that this ground would be defended and that the people trying to cross it would find it exactly as difficult as the people who had prepared it had intended. He could not engage that with the gun. The gun was for tanks and anti-tank positions and vehicle-sized targets that presented themselves at ranges where the 88 millimeters precision and power meant something decisive. The gun was not for the will of 300,000 people embedded in the earth at his feet, expressed in the patient labor of a winter and a spring spent burying metal in the ground so that the summer would be as costly as possible for whoever came across the river. You could not shoot at a decision. You could only try to cross the ground it had prepared for you. Evening came, and the light changed, and the pioneers found a gap. It was a narrow gap, natural rather than engineered. A stretch of ground the Soviet engineers had apparently judged too soft for reliable mine placement and had skipped over. It ran at an angle to the axis of advance rather than straight through, which meant vehicles using it would be briefly exposed on their flanks. But it was there, and by evening it was marked, and infantry began moving through it in small groups, hunched low, moving fast in the failing light. The Tigers could not go through it. The lane was too narrow for tracks that wide. One in the ground on either side had not been cleared. They stayed on the rise and covered the infantry on foot and waited for first light and the engineers' continued work. That night, the Soviets sent up illumination flares at irregular intervals, not constant, intermittent, unpredictable. The kind of rhythm designed to keep the people on the other side awake and watchful, or to replace the ordinary darkness of a night with a darkness that flickered and returned and might flicker again at any moment. It was effective. Karl sat in the gunner's seat for most of those hours, with the sight trained on the minefield belt and the tree line beyond it, watching the flares rise and fall, watching the ground beneath them for movement. Riedel came over the radio in the early hours of the morning. He had information from Hartmann, who had finally gotten his Tiger across the repaired bridge sometime after midnight, along with 2 more vehicles from the platoon. The news was that the crossing was still contested but functional. The rest of the company was making its way across in phases. The word about the situation to the north was brief and not optimistic. The main effort of the southern pincer had made better progress than they had, but the language Riedel used when he relayed the summary was the language of someone reporting facts without endorsing their implications. Karl went back to the gunner's seat before first light. He sat with his eye at the sight and listened to the occasional sounds of the night and thought, not about the battle in the large sense, not about Citadel or the war, or what came after any of this, but about distance. About the specific quality of the ground ahead of him and the angles at which the terrain lay, and the ranges at which various problems were likely to present themselves when the fighting resumed in the morning. Distance had been his discipline since before the Tiger, since the Panzer IV on the flat steppe outside Moscow, where the winter made everything harder and the engagements happened too close for comfort. He had understood even then, as a younger man with less experience, that the advantage in any engagement belonged to the man who controlled the range, that the last thing any soldier wanted was a fair fight, that if you could see the enemy before the enemy could see you, and if you could hit the enemy before the enemy could hit you, then the mathematics of the situation were already decided before the first round was fired. The Tiger had given him the instrument to practice that discipline at its fullest extent. The 88 millimeter gun, the precision optics. In the frontal armor that could absorb what most Soviet guns could deliver at combat ranges, while the Tiger's own gun reached out to distances where Soviet armor could not reliably respond. It was not an equal weapon. It was designed not to be. And Karl had spent months learning its particular behavior at every range, in every atmospheric condition, with a barrel at every temperature from cold start to extended firing, until the gun was less a machine he operated and more a precision instrument he had internalized. What he thought about in the dark on the night of the 5th of July was not tomorrow's objectives. It was the ground between Tiger 133 and the tree line on the far side of the minefield belt, and the ranges at which problems would arise, and the adjustments those ranges and those problems would require from the gun he knew better than he knew almost anything else. Dawn came slowly, and the sky lightened in the east over the ground they had not yet crossed. The flares stopped. The pioneers were already working again before the sun was fully up. On the 6th of July, by mid-morning, they had opened a second lane, wider than the first, properly marked, running at a favorable angle. Infantry and lighter vehicles had been moving through it since before dawn, and by mid-morning Riedel was maneuvering Tiger 133 toward the marked path through the belt. Miller took them through at a speed that was not fast. Carl watched the track impressions on either side of the lane markers through the sight and measured them against the boundary of cleared ground and did not breathe normally until they were through. The ground on the far side was churned by days of artillery, soft in places, cut through by drainage ditches and low earthwork berms. It did not look like terrain designed for an armored advance. It looked like terrain designed to slow one down and break it apart. They formed up on the far side with the other Tigers and waited for the order to move. The order came. Carl put his eye to the sight, the familiar circle of glass, the crosshairs, the particular quality of the world reduced to what could be seen through precision optics at a range that made problems manageable before they became immediate. The engine was running. The ammunition count had changed from what it had been at 3:47 in the morning when the flares went up and the barrage opened and something began that could not be stopped. Ahead of them, to the northeast, across the open ground of southern Russia in the flat, ungenerous light of a July morning, was everything that came next. Carl Wendell was 22 years old. He had been a soldier for 2 years. He had been a gunner for most of that time, on 2 different vehicles, now on 2 different sections of this front. He understood in the functional and unsentimental way that he understood most things, that the 12 days ahead of him would be unlike anything that had come before. He did not know what the 12 days would cost. He put his eye to the sight and began to scan. The 7th of July began the way the days before it had ended. Movement, always movement. Northeast along the axis of the 6th Panzer Divisions pushed toward the high ground that the division needed to reach before the Soviet commanders could consolidate their second defensive belt and make the first one irrelevant by building another behind it. The terrain had changed from what it had been on the eastern bank of the Donets. The drainage ditches and the earthwork berms that had made the ground near the river feel enclosed and channeled had given way to a broader landscape. Shade rolling steppe grassland, broken by occasional copses and the long, low ridge lines characteristic of this part of southern Russia. The summer grass was already browning in the heat. The sky was pale and cloudless, and the light had the flat, ungenerous quality of midday in July at this latitude even in the morning hours. A light that gave no shadows to hide in and no gradations of tone that might help you pick out a distant object against the ground. It was the worst kind of light for a gunner. Everything at distance dissolved into the same washed-out uniformity, and the targets that presented themselves did so not through any contrast of tone, but through movement or shape, the things that the eye found when tone was unavailable. Carl had been scanning for 40 minutes when he saw it. It was stationary. That was the first thing. A T-34 hull down behind a rise at a distance, he estimated at approximately 1,400 meters when he first acquired it, perhaps slightly more. The turret was visible above the crest of the rise. The gun was traversed to cover the approach route Tiger 133 was using. The commander's hatch was open. Carl could see the outline of the commander's head and shoulders above the hatch rim, and from the angle of the man's body he could tell the commander was watching the tree line to the left rather than the open ground ahead. He had not yet acquired them, or he had acquired them and judged them outside his effective engagement range. A shot which at 1,400 meters with a 76mm gun against a Tiger's frontal armor was a reasonable judgment. The T-34's gun could not reliably penetrate the Tiger frontally at that range. At closer distances, it could do damage. To the running gear, to the vision blocks, to a commander standing in an open hatch. At 1,400 meters, it was not a serious threat to the vehicle. What it was a threat to the infantry moving behind them. And it was positioned to call artillery onto the axis of advance once the Tigers had passed, if the vehicle was left unaddressed. Carl told Riedel the range and the bearing. Riedel said nothing for a moment. Carl could hear him working through the tactical calculation. Other vehicles in the area, positions they did not yet have a full picture of. Engaging at this range would announce Tiger 133's position clearly to anything in the surrounding ground that had not yet acquired them. Now, on the other hand, the T-34 had a good field of fire over the approach route, and whoever had placed it there had understood what they were doing. Riedel told him to take the shot when he was ready. Carl wanted to be precise about what this meant because he had heard it described in ways that made it sound like instinct or inspiration, or some quality that existed outside the ordinary mechanics of a human being at work. It was not those things. At 1,400 meters, refined to 1,450 by the time he was ready to fire, the round would travel for approximately 2 seconds before reaching the target. In 2 seconds, a stationary tank did not move in any meaningful sense, but the air through which the round traveled was not uniform, and the slight variations in propellant temperature and barrel condition that accumulated over hours of firing introduced small deviations that had to be accounted for. Yes, you accounted for them not by calculating each variable individually, but by developing over time a sense of the gun's behavior that was more accurate than any formula, because it incorporated everything the formula could not measure. Carl steadied the crosshairs on the junction of the T-34's turret and hull on the left side, the aspect presented to him at that angle. He waited, not for anything specific, for the stillness that preceded the right moment, the point at which the sight picture was as clean as it was going to be, and his body was as settled as it was going to be, and the various small movements always present in a tank on ground that was never perfectly level had aligned into a momentary equilibrium. He fired. The round was in the air for what felt like considerably longer than 2 seconds. He watched the tracer element cross the distance, its trajectory appearing almost flat from his angle, which was an illusion of perspective. At that range, the round followed a significant arc. The sight accounted for the arc. The T-34 burned, not immediately. There was an interval of perhaps 3 seconds between the impact and the first visible fire. The round penetrates. The penetration causes secondary effects. The fuel, the ammunition, the hydraulic fluid in the turret traverse mechanism. Those effects produce the fire. What Carl saw first was the impact itself, when a flash in a deformation of the turret side, visible even at that range, and then the stillness of a vehicle that had been stopped, and then the fire. Riedel said something that Carl did not catch entirely. His voice had shifted from the flat command register he maintained during engagements. It was not an order. It was the kind of thing a man said when he had witnessed something he had not expected to witness. Though the words themselves were not remarkable, Franz made a sound that was not words at all. Carl was already scanning for the next target. This was the part that did not translate well into any account of what had happened. The shot at distance was not a moment of satisfaction or completion. It was a step in a sequence. The moment it was finished, the sequence continued. The target was gone, and the sight moved because there were always more targets or the possibility of more targets, and in the correct response to having eliminated one threat was to search immediately for the next one, without pause, and without the luxury of reaction. Reaction was for afterwards. Afterwards was always somewhere in the future, a country Carl visited in the evenings when the engine was off and the gun was cold. It was a different place than the one he lived in during the day. Riedel reported the engagement to Vogt on the radio. Vogt asked him to confirm the range. Riedel confirmed it. There was a pause on the frequency that Carl heard clearly through the engine noise. Then Vogt acknowledged and the radio moved on to other things. From that moment, Carl's name began to be used differently on the battalion frequency. Not as a designation, not as a rank, as a reference point, a shorthand for something that the numbers alone did not adequately convey. He had not asked for this. He did not want it. It did not change the work. The 8th of July. Carl had been tracking intermittent movement to the east for the better part of 20 minutes before he said anything. Not a clear target, a suggestion of movement at the edge of the sight's effective range, the kind of peripheral disturbance that might be dust from vehicles or animals, or ground haze refracting the morning light, or nothing at all. He had learned not to report every disturbance of this kind. Most of them were nothing. Reporting every uncertainty eroded confidence in the reports that mattered. So he watched. He tracked the movement. He refined his estimate of where it was and what direction it was going. At 9:14, he was certain. A column of T-34s moving south along a track that ran parallel to their axis of advance, approximately 1,800 meters to the east, partially screened by a long rise that concealed the lower hulls, but left the turrets visible in profile. He counted 14 of them, moving at road speed, spaced at intervals that suggested they had not identified Tiger 133's position and were not expecting contact from this direction. The lead vehicle's turret was traversed forward. None of them had their hatches open, he told Riedel. Riedel was quiet for a moment. That was not hesitation, but the rapid processing of a situation with multiple variables. On the radio, he called Hartman and gave him the bearing and the range. Hartman acknowledged. His Tiger was 200 meters to the left and slightly behind, positioned to have a similar angle on the same ground. Fote was further back with two more Tigers, still working through a stretch of soft ground that had slowed his advance. They would not be in position in time. Riedel told Karl to begin engaging when the column reached the point on the track that would give them a perpendicular aspect on the hull, the broad side. Where the armor was thinnest and the round had the most room to work. That point was perhaps 300 meters south of the column's current position. At their current speed, they would reach it in approximately 2 minutes. Karl set the range on the sight and held the crosshairs on the track ahead of the lead vehicle and waited. The 2 minutes felt considerably longer. The expansion of perceived time in the period before an engagement, when the mine was running faster than the situation was developing. He noticed the light falling across the turrets of the T-34s as they moved, the small corrections in bearing as they followed the curve of the track, the interval between vehicles, which he had estimated at 40 meters and which he now revised to 35. The sound of their engines reaching him at this distance filtered through 1,800 meters of summer air, a low, persistent undertone beneath the sound of the Tiger's own engine. The lead vehicle reached the point on the track. Karl fired at 1,800 meters. The round took longer to arrive than at the distances he had been working the previous day, and the correction required for the target's movement was larger. When a moving T-34 at 1,800 meters required leading the aim point by a margin that you learn to feel rather than calculate in the moment. The round caught the lead vehicle at the front of the hull, low, where the transmission housing sat behind the glacis plate. The vehicle stopped. Not dramatically, it simply ceased to move, as if the engine had cut out. Then the smoke began. 11 seconds. And that was approximately how long it took from the first shot to the moment when the column understood what was happening, and the ordered spacing between vehicles became something else entirely. 3 rounds were fired in those 11 seconds. Karl's and Hartman's combined. The second T-34 in the column was Hartman's, caught as it was beginning to accelerate. The third was Karl's, the third vehicle in line, was struck through the turret side at the moment it had begun to traverse toward their position and was presenting its maximum aspect. After 11 seconds, the column was no longer a column. 14 vehicles, 3 of them stopped and burning. 11 of them attempting simultaneously to find cover, accelerate, traverse their guns, and communicate with each other under conditions of sudden extreme stress. Some of them turned east, away from the threat, which was the correct decision but which also meant presenting their thinner rear armor to the sight. Some of them stopped, which was the incorrect decision. 2 of them turned toward the Tigers and attempted to close the distance, which was the most dangerous decision from their perspective, and also the one that most clearly demonstrated why the T-34's 76mm gun was not the primary threat at this range. Karl fired 9 times in the next 6 minutes, not 9 hits. There were misses. Moments when the target moved at the wrong instant, or when dust thrown up by a previous impact obscured the sight picture long enough that the aim point was lost and had to be reacquired. Riedel called corrections when he could see things Karl could not from his angle. Franz loaded without pause. Karl heard him once, briefly, breathing in the particular way a man breathes when he is working at the limit of his physical capacity, not struggling, not failing, running at a rate that could not be sustained indefinitely, and that he knew it. By the end of those 6 minutes, 7 T-34s from the column were destroyed or immobilized. The remaining vehicles had dispersed into the terrain to the east and were no longer a coherent threat on this axis. Hartman's Tiger had contributed 3 of the kills. Karl's had contributed 4. The column had ceased to exist as a tactical entity in approximately the time it took to eat a meal. Carbon residue from the propellant charges had settled on every surface inside the fighting compartment. On Karl's hands, on the sight's rubber padding, on the back of his neck where the collar did not reach. It had a smell entirely specific to this summer. This gun, this cramped space shared by 4 men doing work that could not be described adequately from the outside. Franz said he needed water. Karl passed what remained of his flask back without taking his eye from the sight. It was that evening, in the stillness after the day's last halt, that Franz spoke. Not about the engagement, not about the column or the count, or any of the tactical details that comprised the language the crew used when they spoke at all. Franz spoke about something else entirely, and the fact of it was unusual enough that Carl registered it the way you registered an unexpected sound in a familiar engine. A note that did not belong to the normal operating register. They were in a position between two low ridge lines that Riedel had judged defensible for the night. The engine was cooling. The gun was cold. Riedel was outside the vehicle conferring with Hartmann, who had come over on foot in the way that information passed when you did not want to use the radio. Mueller was asleep in the driver's seat, which he could do with a completeness that Carl had always found remarkable. Franz was cleaning the loading mechanism in the rear of the fighting compartment. He said without any particular introduction that his father had a bakery in Regensburg. Carl did not respond immediately. He was cleaning the breech mechanism, working through the sequence by feel in the dimness of the compartment, and he continued doing that while he registered what Franz had said and what it represented. Franz had not spoken about before the war. None of them had. It was an unspoken agreement of the kind that did not need to be stated to be understood. It's a collective decision to operate in the present tense because the present tense was the only one that had immediate operational relevance. What Franz had been before the Wehrmacht was not information that affected his performance as a loader. The speed of his hands and the reliability of his timing under fire were the things that mattered, and those things Carl knew. But Franz continued. The bakery had been in the family for 2 generations. His father had learned the trade from his grandfather. Franz had been learning it from his father, had been learning the particular arithmetic of flour and water and time. The way a loaf of bread was as much a matter of patience as of technique. The way you could not rush certain processes without ruining the result. He had been an apprentice in his father's shop when the call-up came. The bakery had been damaged in a bombing raid in the spring of 1942. Not destroyed, damaged. The front wall and the display window and part of the roof. His father had written to tell him, a letter that had reached Franz 3 weeks after it was sent, by which point Franz was in a different country doing different work. He did not know the current state of the building. He did not know whether his father had rebuilt it or whether there was anything left to rebuild. He said all of this in the same flat tone he used for everything, without self-pity and without any apparent expectation of response. He said it the way a man said something that had been sitting in him for a long time, and that he had finally found a moment in which saying it did not feel like an intrusion on more important things. Then he went back to cleaning the loading mechanism. Carl finished with the breech and set the cleaning cloth aside. He thought about what Franz had said, not in the sense of analyzing it or formulating a response, but in the simpler sense of letting it exist in the space between them without immediately filling that space with something else. He said nothing, but he heard it, and Franz, Carl understood, had not needed him to say anything. He had needed someone to hear it, and Carl had heard it, and that was sufficient for both of them. Carl had spent 2 years in close physical proximity to men he knew well in the operational sense, and barely knew in any other sense. He knew how Muller's hands moved on the controls during a difficult traverse. He knew the particular sound Franz made when loading under pressure, the breathing pattern that told him the loader was running fast but not failing. He knew the quality of Riedel's silences as precisely as he knew the quality of his transmissions. The difference between the silence of a man processing information and the silence of a man who had already decided and was waiting for the right moment to speak. He did not know what any of them had been before the Wehrmacht. He did not know what they hoped for or feared in ways that had nothing to do with the immediate tactical situation. He did not know whether Franz's father was alive, or the bakery was standing, or whether the front wall had been rebuilt since the 1942 raid. These were things that existed in a different register from the operational knowledge that structured the hours he spent in Tiger 133, and he had not previously had occasion to think about what it meant that they existed at all. Franz's disclosure had not changed anything about the morning that would come or the work the morning would require, but the space between the 2 men in the cooling fighting compartment felt different in a way that was not unwelcome. He thought about patience not being different from technique, but being the same thing expressed across a longer interval. Riedel returned to the vehicle. The night began its slow rotation of watchfulness and interrupted sleep. Carl went to the gunner's seat and put his eye to the sight, and watched the dark ground to the northeast and thought, intermittently, about a bakery in Regensburg and a man who had learned that patience was not different from technique, but was the same thing expressed across a longer interval. The 9th of July brought the artillery. Not the diffuse background artillery that had been a constant condition of the previous days, present in the way that weather was present, an environmental factor rather than a targeted threat. This was adjusted fire, and Karl understood the difference the moment the first salvo landed, and the subsequent salvos began walking south in increments that were not random. Someone with an observation post had their location. The shells were 122mm howitzer rounds. The difference between a 45mm anti-tank round striking a Tiger's frontal armor and a 122mm howitzer round landing 2 meters from the vehicle in open ground was the difference between something you survived with certainty and something that depended entirely on the proximity of the impact and the direction of the fragmentation pattern. It was not a difference that favored staying in one place. Riedel moved the Tiger before the third salvo, not with particular urgency. With the deliberate, unhurried efficiency that Karl had come to recognize as his response to situations that required rapid action, but not panic. The engine went to full power. Muller took them over the rise and down into the dead ground behind it, and the third salvo landed where they had been. They spent the rest of the 9th in a pattern of movement and short halts, never remaining in any one position long enough to be accurately registered. It was not the kind of day that produced clean accounts. It was a day of partial information and interrupted movements, and the constant low-grade alertness that was different from the sharp alertness of an engagement, a duller, more grinding form of attention that was in some ways more exhausting because it never peaked and never released. There was a particular quality to being hunted by artillery that was different from being engaged by direct fire. A tank engaging you directly was a problem with a location. You could find the muzzle flash. You could establish the range. You could act on the information the gun gave you when it fired. Artillery came from somewhere beyond the visible horizon, from a battery you could not see and could not directly engage, operated by men who were reading map coordinates rather than looking through sights at you personally. The impersonality of it had its own weight. You were not a target in any individual sense. You were a set of coordinates on a grid, and the rounds were being walked onto those coordinates by a process that had nothing to do with anything you could do better or worse. You could only move and hope that the observer who had reported your position had not already reported the new one. Riedel understood this and managed the day accordingly. He never stayed still long enough for the adjustment process to complete. He used the dead ground aggressively, the low ridges and drainage depressions and the places where the terrain interrupted the line of sight between their position and wherever the Soviet observation post was working from. It was not elegant work. It was the unglamorous, grinding work of staying alive against a threat that offered no satisfying tactical solution, only the ongoing discipline of movement and the refusal to become predictable. By evening, Karl had fired 3 times, on all at anti-tank gun positions that had been sighted to take advantage of the restricted movement the artillery was forcing. The pattern was deliberate and professionally executed. The artillery herded. The anti-tank guns waited at the places the herding pushed you toward. It was a coordinated system, and the people who had designed it had understood the relationship between the two elements clearly. He noted this without admiration and without resentment. It was effective work. Effective work deserved to be recognized as such. It was also the day Vogt fell ill. The details came through in the flat, compressed way that information traveled when it passed through multiple radio relays. Something intestinal. Probably the water, which had been questionable for days and which the men in the field were drinking regardless because the alternative was not drinking. Vogt was not incapacitated. He was not fit to command a vehicle in active operations. Riedel told Karl that evening in the early darkness before sleep. Someone from the platoon would take Vogt's Tiger for the following day. Karl heard the implication before Riedel made it explicit, and Riedel made it explicit in the flat tone he used for things that were already decided and required only acknowledgement. Karl had never sat in the commander's position during an operation. Vogt's Tiger was numbered 131. On the crew were men Karl knew from daily proximity rather than any particular intimacy. Dieter at the gun, careful and competent, with a methodical quality to his work that was different from Karl's, but served the same ends. The loader, a practical man with no distinctive qualities except the absence of any tendency to make problems for the people around him, which was itself a quality worth having. Schaefer at the radio. Winkler driving, the youngest man in the company, WWII with the company since March, who had the instinctive feel for the vehicle's behavior on soft ground that some drivers had and could not be taught. They accepted the arrangement with the practical ease of men who had been in the field long enough to know that the situation required what the situation required. There was no difficulty about authority. Karl was not their commander in any formal sense. He was a more experienced man filling a temporary gap, and they understood that distinction and worked within it without friction. The 10th of July was quieter than the days before it in terms of direct engagement. This was not the same as safe. Soviet artillery remained active across the sector, and there were at least 2 occasions when Karl made decisions about movement from the commander's cupola that he would not have been asked to make from the gunner's seat. When to halt, when to push forward, and then when the risk of a particular route was acceptable and when it was not. The decisions were not complicated in retrospect. They seemed more complicated at the time because he was aware, in a way he was not from the gunner's seat, of the 3 other men in the vehicle whose survival depended in part on whether those decisions were correct. From the gunner's sight, the world was a specific bounded field of view, a circle of glass that contained precisely what the optics presented and nothing else. Where the range was known, the angle was known, the target was either in the sight picture or it was not. The decisions available to Karl in the gunner's seat were precise and limited, and entirely his own, without consequence for anyone except the target. From the commander's cupola, with the hatch open in the unmediated visual field of a man looking at actual ground rather than a magnified representation of it, the world was wider and less certain. He could see more and understand less of what he was seeing because he had not yet learned to read the wider picture the way he had learned to read the sight. There was a moment in the early afternoon when he had the cupola hatch open and was scanning the terrain to the northeast. The landscape was quiet with that particular quality of quiet that was not silence, but the temporary absence of active fire, the kind that could end at any moment and which you never fully trusted. When he could see 2 Tigers from the platoon stationary on a low rise, approximately 300 meters to his right. Hartmann's vehicle was one of them. He could see Hartmann himself in the commander's hatch, also scanning, also not trusting the quiet. Hartmann turned and looked in his direction. They were both in the open hatches of their respective Tigers, looking at each other across 300 meters of Russian steppe in the midday heat of a July afternoon. Nothing was communicated. Nothing needed to be. Then Hartmann turned back to his sector and Karl turned back to his. Later that afternoon, Dieter reported a target, a 45mm anti-tank gun that had moved into position in a drainage ditch to the northeast, approximately 700 meters out. From the commander's cupola, without the mediation of optics, Karl could see it directly. The crew moving around the gun, the way they crouched and communicated and adjusted their position. The specific human quality of men doing dangerous work under pressure, the same quality that existed on Karl's side of every engagement, and that the sight, by reducing everything to geometry and range, made easier not to think about. From the cupola, it was harder not to think about. He gave Dieter the order. Dieter fired once. The gun position was eliminated with the efficiency that the 88mm delivered at that range. Karl climbed back into the cupola and said nothing. And that night he did not sleep well, not because of anything that had happened that day in any tactical sense, because of a question that had no operational answer and that he had not been asked before. Not in quite this form, not from this specific vantage point. The question was not whether the work was necessary. He had no doubt about that. The question was something smaller and more precise, about the distance between the work as it appeared from the gunner's seat and the work as it appeared from the cupola, and whether the difference between those 2 views of the same events was something that changed the events themselves or only changed the man watching them. He did not resolve it. He went to sleep when sleep came and woke when Riedel shook his shoulder and climbed back into Tiger 133's gunner's seat the following morning when Vogt returned to his own vehicle. Though the sight was where it always was. The breech mechanism was clean. Franz had reloaded the racks while Karl was gone. He put his eye to the sight. The world contracted to the dimensions he knew. The 11th of July was the kind of day you recognized only while it was happening, not because anything was announced, because you could feel the change in how things moved, the rhythm of the radio traffic, the way orders arrived faster and with less qualification. Nara, the sense that someone further up the chain had decided that this was the day something broke. The briefing the previous evening had been longer than usual. Riedel had come back from it and given them the outline in the compressed language he used when he was thinking about more than he was saying. The company, together with elements of the 6th Panzer Division, would push northeast along the axis of the Razumnaya Valley. The Soviet 305th Rifle Division was holding the ground ahead. The objective was to break through their defensive line and reach the high ground beyond it, which would unhinge the entire Soviet position in this sector. It was an ambitious objective for a formation that had been in continuous combat for 6 days. Riedel did not say that. He gave them the objective and the timing and the order of march, and then he let them sleep for 3 hours, which was more than they had slept on any previous night since crossing the Donets. And they moved at first light in a formation Karl had not seen in this operation. All of the company's operational Tigers together. Not dispersed across a wide front but concentrated, moving in close order along a single axis. Karl counted 9 vehicles from his position as they formed up. It was the most Tigers he had seen in one place since the training exercises at Paderborn. The difference between seeing them in training and seeing them in formation on the morning of an attack was a difference he could feel through the hull of the tank before he could articulate it. 9 Tigers moving together produced a sound you felt in the ground before you heard it in the air. The Soviet position began to become visible at approximately 600 meters, not as a line in any organized sense, but as a series of earthworks and dug positions and field fortifications that stretched across the axis of advance and that had clearly been prepared over weeks rather than improvised in response to the German advance. Anti-tank ditches, gun positions with overhead cover, earthwork traverses that created interlocking fields of fire. Whoever had laid this out had understood what they were defending against. Riedel had the Tiger moving before the first Soviet gun fired, not at speed, at a controlled advance that kept the frontal armor presented to the threat axis and gave Karl the stable platform he needed to work the site without losing his reference points. The fight through the Soviet defensive line took approximately 40 minutes. Karl could not give a precise sequential account of it because in those 40 minutes the sequence was not linear. It was simultaneous, not multiple engagements overlapping. The radio carrying traffic from multiple vehicles at once. The sound of the battle outside the tank, a continuous, undifferentiated pressure broken only by the moments when a round struck the hull or when the Tiger's own gun fired and the pressure inside the compartment compressed and released. Franz was loading on a rhythm Karl had never felt from him before, faster than during training, faster than any previous engagement. Finding the rounds in the racks without looking, by memory and by hand, the sequence so deeply internalized that it operated without conscious direction, even as the vehicle lurched over broken ground and the noise made communication impossible, and everything that was not essential fell away. What Karl remembered in distinct images, a 76mm anti-tank gun at 400 meters that had put 2 rounds into the lower hull of the Tiger to their left, engaged as it was traversing for a third shot. EOT-34 appearing from behind a burning vehicle at less than 300 meters, moving fast, attempting to get alongside where the side armor was thinner. The traverse and the shot in a movement that had no calculation in it, only the accumulated repetition of months of training expressing itself at the moment when there was no time for anything else. The T-34 did not complete the maneuver. There was a moment somewhere in the middle of those 40 minutes when Karl became aware of a quality of sound that was different from the sounds of the preceding days. Not louder, not more intense. Differently distributed. The fire that had been coming from ahead of them in organized, overlapping patterns from multiple prepared positions was beginning to lose its pattern. The intervals were changing. The coverage was becoming uneven. Schmack guns that had been firing with the regularity of a unit holding its position were beginning to fire at different rates, some faster, some slower, some going quiet in ways that were not tactical pauses, but the silences of positions that had been eliminated or abandoned. Carl noted this not as information he processed consciously, but as a change in the texture of the sound environment that his body registered before his mind articulated it. The way a sailor feels a shift in the wind before he sees it in the rigging, the way certain things are known through the body's accumulated experience before they are known any other way. The moment when a defensive line breaks is not a dramatic thing. There is no single event that marks it. What happens is that the pattern of fire changes. The organized, disciplined fire of a unit holding a prepared position becomes something else. Less directed, less sustained. Gaps appear in coverage. When men in vehicles begin moving rearward rather than holding their positions, and then the gap is there, the physical gap in the earthworks that the Tigers push through. They drove through in column, one behind the other, and came out onto the high ground beyond the Soviet line. The terrain opened ahead of them. The Razumnaya Valley was visible to the north, the ground falling away and rising again toward objectives that now seemed, for the first time in 6 days, actually reachable. Riedel halted the Tiger on the crest of the rise. Carl kept the sight on the retreating Soviet positions. Vehicles moving northeast in disorder, mixing with infantry on foot and horse-drawn guns. He fired 3 times in the next 10 minutes, selecting the vehicles that had sufficient capability remaining to reorganize and reestablish a defensive position if they reached the ground ahead. The other targets he let go. A retreating man on foot was not a tank. The gun was for tanks. Then the radio brought Prokhorovka. Not as a complete picture, as fragments, the way large events always arrived when you were at the edge of the information network rather than its center. Transmissions relayed from further up the chain, passing through multiple frequencies, losing detail at each relay, arriving stripped of context and sequence. What Carl could assemble from the fragments was this. To the north, somewhere in the area of Prokhorovka, as the SS Panzer formations that constituted the strongest element of the southern pincer had encountered the Soviet armored reserves. The scale of the engagement was large, possibly the largest armored engagement of the war. The reports were contradictory in the specific way that reports from large engagements were always contradictory while they were happening, when different observers were seeing different pieces of a situation too large for any single observer to comprehend. While Carl listened to the transmissions and tried to assemble them into something coherent, he could not. What he could determine was that the outcome at Prokhorovka was not decided, that the SS formations had not broken through, that the Soviet armored reserves had not been destroyed, that the engagement was continuing and its resolution was not yet apparent from the fragments reaching them on this frequency. Riedel listened to the same transmissions. Yes, he turned off the radio after the last relay and looked out over the Razumnaya Valley below them, the valley they had just broken through to reach, the high ground they were standing on, the objectives that had finally seemed reachable an hour ago. Carl understood what Riedel was doing with those transmissions, the same calculation Carl was making. If Prokhorovka did not resolve in favor of the German advance, if the Soviet armored reserves remained intact and capable of offensive action, then the position the 6th Panzer Division had reached at the cost of 6 days of continuous combat was a position that could be outflanked and surrounded. The high ground they were standing on, for which men on both sides had paid prices that Carl had witnessed in specific and concrete detail, would become a liability rather than an asset. The valley below them was quiet now. The afternoon light fell across it with the flat quality that made everything look almost peaceful from behind glass. Riedel turned the radio back on. Neither of them said anything about what the silence between the transmissions had meant. There was nothing to say that the transmissions had not already said. They held the high ground and watched the valley and waited for orders. And the orders that came were not the orders either of them had expected 6 days ago when the Tiger had crossed the Donets in the dark, and the advance had felt, if not certain, at least directional. The radio traffic in the following 48 hours carried the shape of what was coming before the shape had a name. References to consolidated positions, shortened supply lines, redeployment of assets, the language of men who had decided something but had not yet said it. Carl listened and understood and returned to the site and watched the ground ahead for movement that required a response. For long stretches there was none. And in those stretches, he was aware of the quality of the light on the step in the middle of a July afternoon, the way it flattened everything and removed the shadows that gave the landscape depth. He was aware of the sound of the engine, which had been running for so many consecutive hours that it had ceased to register as a sound and had become a condition, the way constant background noise becomes inaudible when it no longer carries new information. And he was aware of the way the valley looked from this elevation, the ground falling away to the north toward objectives that had seemed, for an hour, within reach. He was aware of the weight of the preceding 6 days in a way that was not physical exhaustion, though it was also that, but a denser kind of weight. The accumulated weight of decisions made and consequences registered and information processed without adequate time for any of it to settle into the categories the mind preferred. He sat at the site and watched the ground for movement that required a response and thought about nothing in particular and waited for the radio to tell him what came next. It did not stay that way. It never stayed that way. The order came on the 16th of July. It did not arrive as a surprise. The radio had been carrying the shape of it for 2 days before the words were spoken, the way weather carries the shape of a storm before the storm arrives. The language of the tactical transmissions had been shifting in small but legible ways. References to consolidated positions, shortened supply lines, redeployment of assets to alternate sectors, the vocabulary of men who have decided something but have not yet said it. Karl had been listening to battalion radio nets long enough to read that vocabulary. When commanders begin discussing defensive positions in terrain you have already advanced through, the direction of travel has changed even if no formal order has yet been issued. When the language of forward progress is quietly replaced by the language of economy and consolidation, the strategic decision has already been made somewhere above you, and what you are waiting for is the transmission that makes it official. Riedel told him the night before. He came to the gunner's position in the early darkness, not on the radio, in person, his voice low and without inflection. Look, the way he spoke when something was already decided and required only acknowledgement. Operation Citadel was being suspended. The regiment would withdraw to the western bank of the Donets over the following 2 days. The Tigers would cover the withdrawal of the infantry and the lighter vehicles. They would be the last German vehicles to cross the river. Karl heard this and said nothing for a moment. Not because he was surprised, but because there was a particular quality to hearing a thing stated plainly that was different from having anticipated it, a finality that anticipation did not carry. He thought about the bridge, the same bridge they had crossed 12 days before in the darkness under Soviet artillery fire. When the advance had felt not certain, that word was never accurate, but directional, moving towards something rather than away from it. Now they would cross it in the other direction. He went back to the gunner's site and watched the darkness and did not sleep. The 16th was the harder day. The Soviets had understood what was happening before the order reached the men executing it. They had understood it probably before it was formally given, because a Soviet reconnaissance network that had spent 5 months preparing the defense of this ground was not going to miss the signs of a German withdrawal. The pressure from the northeast had increased by the time Tiger 133 began moving southwest, as if the act of pulling back had created a vacuum that the Soviet formations were already pushing into. Riedel ran the Tiger in reverse for long stretches of that day. This was a deliberate tactical choice, keeping the frontal armor toward the threat axis, maintaining Karl's angle on the pursuing forces, allowing the gun to work without the vehicle having to turn and expose the thinner side plating. It was the correct decision. It was also a decision that placed extraordinary demands on Muller, because driving a 57-ton vehicle in reverse at operational speed over uneven ground that had been chewed apart by 12 days of artillery and tracked vehicles was not the same as driving it forward. The feedback through the controls was different. The visibility from the driver's position was worse. The tendency of the vehicle to drift on the soft sections of ground was harder to correct in reverse than forward, requiring constant small adjustments that accumulated over hours into a sustained physical effort that Karl was aware of even through the noise and the vibration and the demands of his own work at the gun. Miller managed it. He managed it for hours without a word that Karl could hear, his hands on the controls making the corrections as they were needed. When keeping the Tiger moving at the pace Riedel required, tracking a line southwest through terrain that offered no good lines and required constant improvisation. Karl was aware of this the way he became aware of the people around him when the situation stripped everything down to what was essential. Franz loading behind him, the rhythm of his hands precise and unbroken even as the vehicle lurched and corrected over rough ground. Riedel above, his voice on the radio building and revising the tactical picture across the full width of their sector, making the decisions about when to hold and when to move, and which approaching vehicle represented the most immediate threat to the infantry columns moving behind them, and Muller, silent at the controls, driving the hardest kind of driving there was, without being asked to and without complaint. The Soviet armor following them was T-34s mostly, or with several of the newer variants that carried the commander's cupola with all-around vision blocks. Karl had been watching those cupola variants across the preceding days and had noted how their commanders used the improved visibility. They were better at acquiring targets at distance than the earlier versions. They used the advantage well. What they were doing now was not reckless. They were maintaining distance, staying at the outer edge of their effective engagement range, not closing aggressively but sustaining pressure, attempting to force the withdrawal to accelerate toward the crossing point faster than it could handle, trying to compress the retreating Germans into the bottleneck of the bridge before the rear guard could be properly organized. It was a competent approach. Against Tigers at this range, it was not sufficient. But it was competent, and Karl noted it without condescension. Well, because a competent enemy was the kind that kept you from making the errors that a less competent enemy would allow you to survive. He fired 11 times on the 16th of July. 4 of the rounds were misses or marginal impacts. The combination of reverse movement, uneven ground, multiple targets presenting simultaneously, will ruin the accumulated fatigue of 12 days in a fighting compartment, degraded the quality of the shooting below what it had been in the deliberate engagements of the earlier days. Karl noted this without distress and without the particular friction of self-criticism that serves no operational purpose. Degraded conditions produced degraded results. The work was still productive enough to keep the pursuit at a distance that allowed the infantry behind them to move. That was the measurement that mattered, not the count, not the percentage. Whether the men on foot behind Tiger 133 were still moving, they were still moving. The night between the 16th and the 17th was spent in a position 4 kilometers east of the Donets. Riedel had chosen the ground carefully, a slight elevation that provided observation over the main approach routes from the northeast, the enough dead ground behind the crest to conceal the lower hull of the Tiger from direct observation, and the river visible to the north, the bridge a darker shape against the water in the intermittent light of the Soviet illumination flares. The other Tigers of the company were distributed across a line that covered the primary approaches. Karl could see their silhouettes when the flares went up, dark geometric shapes against the pale night sky, stationary and watchful. He could hear them on the radio, brief exchanges, situation reports, the compressed language of men who had been working alongside each other long enough to communicate the essential information in the fewest possible words. Franz had found a small amount of water from somewhere. Karl did not ask where. Franz passed it forward without comment, and Karl drank without taking his eye from the sight for more than a moment, and neither of them said anything about it afterward. Small things of this kind were the texture of how a crew managed the hours between engagements. Not friendship exactly. Something more functional than friendship and, in its own way, more reliable. The accumulated small acts of men who understood that their survival was a collective project, even when the work felt individual. Muller had been asleep for 2 hours in the driver's position. Riedel was doing what Riedel always did when the gun was cold and the engine was quiet, which was to sit in the commander's position and listen to the radio and build his picture of what was happening across the full width of the sector, beyond what any single vehicle could observe directly. Karl had learned over 2 years that this was the invisible work of command, the continuous synthesis of incomplete information into decisions that had to be made before the information was complete. Because in this kind of fighting, the information was never complete, and waiting for it to become complete was itself a decision with consequences. Karl did not sleep. He sat at the site and watched the flares rise and fall over the ground to the northeast, watching the terrain beneath them for movement. There was movement. Soviet infantry probing forward through the darkness, testing the coverage, mapping the positions of the Tigers for the morning. They did not attempt to advance against the armor in the dark. They were patient. They knew where the Tigers were going. They had the morning to work with, and the morning would bring the narrowing of options that always came with a retreating force approaching its single point of crossing. Sometime after midnight, Hartmann came on the radio. His voice was the same as it had always been across 12 days of continuous combat. Measured, specific, no excess syllables, no unnecessary framing. He gave Riedel his sector situation in the efficient way of two experienced men who have worked alongside each other long enough that the communication carries more information than the words alone contain. Karl listened to the exchange and thought about the river and about the ground they would cross again in the morning. Then Riedel's voice changed, not dramatically, not in a way that anyone who had not spent 12 days in a sealed metal compartment with the man would have noticed. But Karl had spent 12 days in that compartment, and he noticed. Riedel said something to Hartmann about the morning's movement, the timing of the withdrawal from this position to the bridge approach, the coordination between Tiger 133 and Tiger 112 during the final 4 kilometers. The details were tactical, the content was correct, but the register was different by a fraction that Karl could not have named, but could clearly hear. He filed it and said nothing, and watched the flares. Then what happened to Hartmann's Tiger occurred at approximately 9:15 in the morning of the 17th, 2 kilometers east of the bridge. It was not enemy fire. That was the thing. After 12 days of Soviet anti-tank guns and Soviet artillery and Soviet tanks pressing from every direction on every axis. After all of that, what stopped Tiger 112 on the morning of the withdrawal was the gearbox. The transmission housing on the Tiger was a known vulnerability, not in the sense of being thin-skinned against enemy fire, but in the engineering sense. The gearbox was complex and demanding and not forgiving of extended use in the conditions of the Russian summer. The heat and the dust and the sustained operational tempo that ground down mechanical systems the way sustained combat ground down the men operating them. So Tiger 112 had been running for 12 consecutive days across terrain that destroyed lesser vehicles and had been asking more of its mechanical components than the engineers who designed them had calculated as sustainable. The gearbox gave way 2 kilometers from safety. This was the thing about machines. They did not fail according to the logic of the situation. They did not hold together because the situation required them to hold together. Did not choose their moment of failure based on whether the failure was convenient or catastrophic. The Tiger was an exceptional machine in many ways. It was not a machine that transcended the physical limitations of its components, and its components had been asked across 12 consecutive days to perform at a level that wore them in ways that were cumulative and not always visible until the cumulation reached its limit. Karl heard the transmission on the radio first. Hartmann's voice, a still measured, still specific, reporting the failure with the same tone he used to report enemy contact or ammunition status. A statement of fact, an assessment of options. The options were limited. The vehicle could not be towed in the time available, not with Soviet armor pressing from the northeast and the bridge crossing window narrowing. A Tiger that could not move under its own power and could not be evacuated was a Tiger that could not be allowed to fall into Soviet hands. Karl kept his eye at the site. He was watching the approach to the northeast, tracking the Soviet armor that had been maintaining its pressure through the morning. He was doing his job, but part of his attention, the part that was not required by the immediate geometry of the gunsight and the approaching vehicles, was on the radio and on what was happening 2 kilometers to his left. He heard Hartmann's crew dismount. He heard the brief exchanges between Hartmann and Riedel, practical and compressed, the kind of conversation that takes place when a decision has already been made, and the conversation is about execution rather than deliberation. Before the smoke fully rose, Hartmann's voice came on the frequency one last time. Not a report, not a request. Just his call sign stated once, in the same measured tone he had used for every transmission across 12 days. Then the frequency returned to static, and then, through the sight, Karl saw the smoke. One not Soviet smoke, not the smoke of a vehicle hit by an anti-tank round or penetrated by a shell that ignited the fuel and the ammunition in the catastrophic way that Soviet tank crews feared. This was different smoke, controlled, rising from a specific point inside the vehicle, from charges placed by men who knew the vehicle's vulnerabilities better than anyone, on a place to destroy the gun, in the optics, in the engine, and everything that made a tiger rather than a 57-ton obstacle. Hartman was burning his own tank, the most experienced man in the company, the man whose Tiger had worked alongside Tiger 133 across every sector and every engagement of the past 12 days, whose voice on the radio Carl had used as a reference point the way a navigator uses a fixed star. Standing outside his vehicle in the open ground 2 kilometers east of the Donets River, setting fire to the machine he had commanded, because the machine had failed him in the one way that enemy fire had not. The smoke rose straight in the still morning air. Carl kept his eye at the sight and said nothing. There was nothing to say that Hartman had not already said by the way he spoke his own call sign into a radio for the last time. The 4 kilometers to the bridge took the better part of 3 hours. The Soviet pressure had intensified with the daylight, as it always did, as the T-34 commanders grew more confident when they could see what they were pursuing and when the geometry of the retreat made the direction of travel obvious and the options for the retreating force increasingly narrow. The bridge was the only crossing point. Everyone on both sides knew where everything was going. And the question was only whether the rearguard could reach it before the pursuit could close the gap. Carl fired 6 times in those 3 hours. The first 2 engagements were at ranges above 1,000 meters, deliberate work with adequate time for the sight picture to settle and the calculations to resolve themselves cleanly. The next 2 were faster, targets that presented briefly and required quicker decisions about whether the threat was immediate enough to justify the round. Both were. The 5th was a Soviet anti-tank gun crew that had moved forward and set up in a drainage ditch to the left of the approach road, attempting to take Tiger 133 in the flank at approximately 800 meters. Carl engaged the position before it could fire a second time. The 6th round was at 600 meters. A T-34 had pushed through a gap in the cover to the left of the main approach, Wonky coming onto the road at an angle that brought it broadside to Carl's position, and that required immediate response. There was no time for the particular quality of deliberateness that Carl preferred at longer ranges. There was no time for anything except the trigger and what followed from it. At 600 meters, a stationary T-34 presenting its full side profile to an 88mm gun was not a problem that required extended calculation. It was a problem that required only the execution of something already internalized past the point of conscious thought. Carl fired. The T-34 did not complete its turn onto the road. The bridge was intact. This registered as a fact rather than a relief, because relief implied that the outcome had been in doubt in a way that required emotional resolution, and Carl had spent 12 days in conditions that had long since exhausted whatever capacity he had for that kind of resolution. The bridge was intact. The approach was clear. Miller took Tiger 133 onto the crossing at the same deliberate pace he had used 12 days before in the pre-dawn darkness. Not fast, not hesitant. The pace of a man who understood the weight of what he was driving and respected what the structure beneath him was being asked to carry. The river was the same river. The light was different. Morning light rather than pre-dawn darkness, and from a different direction, and the sun behind them now instead of ahead of them, casting the Tiger's shadow forward onto the bridge surface as they crossed. The eastern bank behind them was lit with the flat, ungenerous quality of a July morning, and Carl could see through the sight the Soviet artillery working over the approach they had just vacated, rounds landing in the patterns of adjusted fire, seeking a target that was no longer there. Halfway across, Riedel spoke. He had been largely silent through the final approach and the bridge crossing, managing the radio traffic that accompanied the end of any large operation. The transmissions from battalion and from further up the chain that carried the administrative language of a withdrawal being completed and a line being reconsolidated. His voice had been flat and operational, the command register that Carl had learned to read across 2 years in 2 vehicles. What he said now was not an order. When he said it quietly, and the engine noise and the radio static meant that Carl caught only part of it, but the part he caught was enough. Something about the gun, about the range of the first engagement on the 7th of July, about what it meant to do that kind of work consistently across 12 days, under the conditions they had been working in. It was not a speech. It was not an extended commendation in the formal sense. It was a single observation from a man who did not make observations of that kind unless he had thought about them for a long time and decided they were worth saying, and who had chosen this moment to say it because this was the moment when it was true in a way that required acknowledgement before the moment passed. Karl did not respond. Not because he was indifferent to what had been said, because there was no response that would have added anything to it. And the observation was accurate or it was not, and Riedel was not a man who made inaccurate observations, and so it was accurate, and accuracy did not require commentary. He kept his eye at the sight and watched the eastern bank recede. On the western bank, Riedel closed the hatch. The engine was still running. Outside, the sounds of the withdrawal continued. When the movement of vehicles and the calls of men organizing a retreat that was disciplined enough to function, but exhausted enough that the discipline was the only thing holding the function together. The radio carried traffic from battalion and from further up. Everything repositioning, everything becoming something other than what it had been for the preceding 12 days. Karl sat at the site and looked through it at the eastern bank. Through the optics, at this distance, moving away from it at the speed of a vehicle on a road, the eastern bank was ordinary ground. Earth and grass, and the marks of tracked vehicles, and the small craters left by artillery rounds that had landed in the soil and detonated and left their evidence without changing anything essential about the landscape. The tree line was still there. The slight elevation of the ground to the northeast was still there. The river itself, visible now from the western bank, and was the same color it had been on the morning of the 4th when Karl had looked at it through the vision block in the pre-dawn dark and tried to see a thing he could not yet see. It looked like nothing, like somewhere you had passed through without stopping, like ground that had not been the site of 12 days of continuous armored combat, the breach of a prepared defensive system built by 300,000 people over 5 months. The advance and the stalling, and the breakthrough and the withdrawal and all of the specific acts that together constituted what Operation Citadel had been and had failed to become. Then Karl saw them, through the optics, at the edge of the effective range of the site on the ground they had crossed on the morning of the 7th. And on the approach routes Tiger 133 had used when moving northeast toward the objectives that had briefly seemed reachable from the crest of the ridge on the afternoon of the 11th. He could see figures moving, small at this distance, reduced by the optics to shapes rather than individuals, but recognizable in their movement and their purpose. Soviet engineers, working in the methodical way that engineers work when they know what they are doing and have done it before. Moving along the routes that the Tigers had used, along the lanes that the German pioneers had cleared through the minefield belt at such cost over the night of the 4th and the 5th, carrying the tools of their trade, doing the work that needed to be done now that the ground was theirs again. They were putting the mines back, not hastily, not in the improvised way of a force reacting to unexpected circumstances, with the deliberate efficiency of people returning to a task they had been interrupted from, restoring a system they understood thoroughly, replacing what had been removed with what they had prepared to replace it. The lanes the German pioneers had marked and cleared were being closed. The approach routes that had cost days of fighting to open were being sealed. The ground that had changed hands was changing hands again, and the people to whom it was returning were not treating the return as a restoration of something that had been lost so much as a completion of something that had been temporarily interrupted. Karl watched this through the sight as the Tiger moved west along the road, and the range increased and the figures became smaller, and finally were no longer individually distinguishable from the general texture of the eastern bank. He said nothing. 12 days. And the ground was already forgetting them. Franz asked if there was water. Karl checked the flask. There was nothing left. There had not been anything left for some time, and the question had been asked not because Franz expected a different answer, but because some things need to be said, even when the saying of them changes nothing. Karl set the flask down and returned his attention to the site. The site was clean. He had cleaned it that morning in the dark during the last halt before the withdrawal resumed, working by feel in the cramped space of the fighting compartment, wiping the glass surface with the cloth he kept in the left pocket of his uniform jacket. The habit of maintenance was one of the first things he had learned, and one of the last he would have abandoned regardless of conditions. Because a site that was not clean was a site that could not be trusted. And a site that could not be trusted was a problem that had no solution except the site itself. The gun was clean. He had cleaned the breech mechanism during the same halt, the same habitual attention to the components that made the work possible. The bore had been swabbed after the last round fired on the approach to the bridge. The mechanisms functioned. The optics were undamaged. Everything that needed to work was working. He sat back slightly and let his eye rest for a moment from the rubber padding of the sight, looking at the interior of the fighting compartment rather than through the glass. The carbon residue from the propellant charges was on every surface, on his hands, on the backs of his hands and the creases of his knuckles and under his fingernails, on the sight's rubber padding where his forehead had rested for cumulative hours across 12 days, on the collar of his jacket where the cloth met the back of his neck. Franz was quiet behind him. Miller drove and said nothing, as Miller always drove and said nothing, his attention on the road and the condition of the surface and the behavior of the Tiger's tracks on the ground beneath them. Riedel was on the radio. His voice returned to the operational register of the command frequency, dealing with the administrative residue of the withdrawal. Fuel status. Ammunition count. The coordination with battalion about where the company would assemble and what came next. What came next? Karl counted the remaining rounds. The number was low, lower than it had been on the morning of the 4th, when he had counted them in the dark on the western bank, with the engine off and the hatches closed and the battle still only a thing on a map. The rounds had gone where rounds went in 12 days of continuous armored combat. They had been used for the purpose they had been manufactured for. The racks were lighter now. The work they represented was complete. He had counted rounds many times in many different circumstances. After a long engagement, the count was a form of accounting, the mind's way of establishing what remained and what had been spent, and what the difference between those two numbers meant for the next engagement. But counting the rounds now, on the western bank, moving away from the eastern bank in the 12 days that the eastern bank contained, the counting felt different in a way he did not immediately have words for. The rounds were the same rounds. They weighed the same and would do the same work at the same ranges with the same precision. The gun was unchanged. The sight was unchanged. Everything that constituted the physical instrument of the work was exactly as it had been on the morning of the 4th. And yet something about counting them now, with the eastern bank receding through the optics and the Soviet engineers visible at the limit of the sight's range already beginning the work of restoration, made the count feel like a different kind of number than it had been before. Not more or less than what it was, just located differently in relation to everything around it, the way a word can mean the same thing and yet sound different depending on the sentence it inhabits. He did not pursue the thought. It was the kind of thought that belonged to afterwards, to the evenings when the engine was off and the gun was cold. He was not yet in that country. He thought about the racks on the morning of the 4th, the full load. The weight of them that Franz had loaded and reloaded across 12 days with the speed and reliability that Karl had trained him to, and that had expressed itself at every moment when the difference between a round available and a round not available was the difference between an engagement that ended one way and an engagement that ended another. He thought about Hartmann's smoke rising straight in the still morning air. He thought about Riedel's voice on the bridge, the fraction of difference that was not an order. He thought about the Soviet engineers on the Eastern Bank, working in the methodical way of people who know what they are doing, putting back what had been removed, closing what had been opened, restoring the ground to what it had been prepared to be. 300,000 people had worked for 5 months to build what the German armor had spent 12 days trying to break through. And now the ground was accepting its people back. When the work was being undone, and the lanes that had been cleared at such cost were being sealed, and the minefield belt was being restored. And by the time the next attempt came from whichever direction and in whichever year that attempt materialized, the ground would be ready again. The Tiger moved west. Outside, through the hull, Karl could hear the sounds of the larger withdrawal. Other vehicles on the road, the calls of men coordinating movement, the periodic distant percussion of artillery working over the sectors to the north and east where other formations were completing their own withdrawals along their own axes toward their own crossings. Everything converging on the western bank. Everything reorganizing into the defensive posture that the radio traffic had been describing for 2 days before the order was given. Karl had crossed the Donets before. Not this river, not this crossing, but other rivers, other withdrawals, other moments when the direction of movement reversed and the ground you had advanced through became the ground you were moving away from. He had been on the Panzer IV when that happened outside Moscow in the winter of 1941, when the advance that had seemed unstoppable found the limit it had been approaching without anyone acknowledging the approach. He had been younger then and less certain about what the reversal meant. He was not certain now about what it meant in the strategic sense that the men above Riedel's level were responsible for interpreting. He was not in a position to make that assessment and would not have been more certain about it if he were. What he was certain about was narrower and more specific. He was certain about the gun and the sight and the ground they had covered and the work they had done on that ground. He was certain about Franz loading without pause on the morning of the 11th, when the 40 minutes of breakthrough required everything he had. He was certain about Muller's hands on the controls during the long hours of the reverse withdrawal on the 16th. He was certain about what Riedel's voice on the bridge had meant, the fraction of difference that was not an order. These were the things he had. They were small in relation to what had happened and was happening and would continue to happen across the full scope of the war on this front. They were not small in any other sense. The engine sound settled into the register that Karl had stopped hearing as a sound and had started hearing as a condition, the baseline beneath everything else, the thing that told you the machine was still functioning and the road ahead was still navigable, and the work, whatever form the work would take next, was not finished. He did not know what came after Kursk. None of them did. The radio gave fragments, and the fragments added up to an outline that could be perceived but not yet fully read. That the summer of 1943 had not gone the way the map suggested it would go. That the direction of the war on this front had shifted in a way that was not yet fully legible from the seat of a tiger moving west on a road in southern Russia in the middle of July. That the distance, in every sense of that word, between where they were now and where the summer had been supposed to take them was a distance that could not be closed by any calculation Karl knew how to make. What he knew was the sight and the gun in the distance. He put his eye back to the rubber padding and looked through the glass at the road ahead, at the western bank of the Donets opening up in front of them, at the ordinary Russian summer landscape moving past in the optics at the speed of a retreating vehicle. The road was navigable. The machine was functioning. The work was not finished. Karl Wendel continued to fight on the Eastern Front for nearly 2 more years. He was 22 years old when he crossed the Donets in July of 1943. He died in April of 1945, 3 weeks before the war ended. The gun never knew that.